Well, I'm in the middle of a series. Every once in a while, I like to just kind of share with you what I've been reading about Jesus scholarship and what I've been learning and how it changes my thinking about Jesus. And I'm constantly kind of asking the question, who is Jesus? And who was he really? What was he all about? So today what I want to do is I want to begin by reading a passage from the book of Acts. This is probably a passage when I think about who Jesus was that I wouldn't typically read, but I'll explain why I am in a little bit. For some reason or other, let me say before I read the passage, when the Bible was put together, Acts was separated from Luke. Even though from the very beginning when the original manuscripts were assembled and the Bible the canon as it's called, was put together, everyone knew that Luke and Acts were written by the same author, and that the author had intended that Luke would be the story of Jesus and Acts would be the story of the early church. And so they should go together. Nevertheless, when those who put the canon together, the final books of the Bible, they separated the two by the Gospel of John. And there are reasons for that I'm not going to go into today. So just keep that in mind, that Acts and Luke were both written by the same author. So Luke tells the story of the life of Jesus and ends with the resurrection, death and resurrection. And then Acts begins with Jesus gathering with the disciples. So when they had come together, the disciples asked him, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" And he said, "It is not for you to know the times or the periods that the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." When he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going, and they were gazing up towards heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them, and they said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking up at heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you now saw him go into heaven." Now, when I think about the things that Jesus did and said, this passage sits kind of outside my circle of understanding because, I'm a fairly practical guy, materialistic in the sense that I have never personally witnessed anyone ascending to heaven. And so, when I think of a story that says that Jesus ascended to heaven, then that's, to me, it's kind of outside the realm of where I live. And so I typically don't pay a lot of attention to those kind of stories. But as I have talked about in recent weeks, I've been reading some books on Jesus and scholarship about Jesus that talks about memory and the way Jesus was remembered, and kind of challenges us to ask the question about Jesus, not what he did, what can be proven by scientific fact or historical analysis, but how was he remembered? And why was he remembered the way he was remembered? And so I read this passage and I ask those questions. Why was Jesus remembered in this way? Why was this important to the community that remembered him in this way? And today I want to talk about a particular aspect of memory. This is touching on memory research that's going all across social science fields, but it's also impacting the study of Jesus and scholarship about Jesus. And one of the interesting things about memory and the way memory works is that stories and narrative are really important in memory. I mean, we memorize facts, and we can store those facts, and we can remember them, and we can recite them. But our lives are not shaped by facts. Our lives are shaped by stories. The stories that we have been told, and the stories that we tell about ourselves, and the stories we tell about others. And so, when we are remembering Aunt Wilma, who died 10 years ago, we don't rewind a tape in our brain of the events that happened in our life. I've said this over and over again each week. Our brains are not computers where we got this little camera going and it's just storing away data that we can just then tap into on a hard drive somewhere in there. That's not the way it works. The way it works when we think about Wilma who died is that we tell stories. We think about the stories we remember about her life that impacted our lives, and those are the stories that we tell. Now let me give you a couple more examples about the way this works before I talk about Jesus in memory. I've talked before here about my own experience growing up in a family of hunters. My middle name is Hunter, J. Hunter Steele. I actually was embarrassed by that for years. Couldn't understand why my parents gave me that name. It turned out it had nothing to do with hunting. It had to do with the fact that one of my parents' best friends' first name was Hunter, and they almost named me Hunter, and didn't. But nevertheless, it fits because I grew up in a family of hunters. On both sides of my family, my mom and my dad, everyone, all the males, and a few of the females, hunted. And from as long as I can remember back to being a child, at family gatherings, wherever we were, I listened to stories of hunting. My dad and my uncles and my grandfathers and my great-uncles would get together, and they didn't do a statistical analysis of where the deer were or deer behavior. They told stories about hunting. Year after year after year after year, I heard the stories. I heard the same stories over and over again. And as time went on, there would be more stories, and eventually I was added to some of those stories. But those stories, they shaped my life. As a boy and a young man, I measured my life, my manhood, against these stories. And I heard other stories, and those other stories were important as well. But this was a part of what I learned through the stories of what it means to be a man. And those stories are very powerful in my memory. And when I think about my deceased relatives, this is what I remember. I mean, I can picture them, I can picture faces and recall some facts about them. But what I remember and what impacts me still is the stories I heard, the stories I've told, and continue to tell about them that have changed my life over the years. And this is how important narrative and stories are in our lives. It is the stories that shape our lives. It is the stories that we measure our lives against when we think about important people in our lives, how our stories measure up against their stories. Another example from modern politics. When I say the name Ronald Reagan, what comes to mind? Okay. See, now I knew if Dennis were still among us, that I would have gotten some response like that. And that's another story for those who remember Dennis. Whatever one thinks of Ronald Reagan, what I find fascinating today is that if you are a Republican politician, you cannot escape telling stories about Ronald Reagan. To say the name Ronald Reagan in those circles, I mean, I listened to some of the debates among the Republicans who wanted to be president, and you couldn't get through a debate without every single one of those politicians invoking the memory of Ronald Reagan and trying to say why they were like Ronald Reagan. To say his name evokes, a whole host of images. The Gipper, Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down, morning in America. Government is not the solution. Government is the problem. The things that he talked about, the stories he told. The memory of Ronald Reagan haunts Republicans. I don't mean haunts in a bad way. I mean, it's a specter that is there. He changed the face of politics in America, whether you liked him or didn't like him. And particularly for those who are Republicans, completely redefined what it means to be a conservative politician. And every one of those politicians, ever since Reagan is gone, and it probably will be this way for a generation or so, in some way or another, when they think about what it means to be a good conservative Republican, they measure their lives against the memories and the stories that are told of Ronald Reagan. And of course, it would be an interesting conversation with someone like Reagan, who lived fairly recently, to measure the facts about the man against the stories and the myth. But that actually gets to the point that I'm trying to make here this morning, and that is the stories and the myth are bigger and more impactful than any facts that you can find about the person. It is the stories that are told and then the myth that develops around that person that matters, that makes the difference.